One thing I've looked at a lot on this channel is the big brain moments within Formula 1. Things like blown diffusers, double diffusers, dual axis steering. Actually, I haven't really covered that one yet. I might have to at some point. And other stuff like Colin Chapman's wings and Brabham's fan car, where it sucked itself to the ground using a big, massive, fan. And usually the reaction from other teams is, I didn't think of this, so I want it banned. And this isn't a new thing that Christian Horner started doing about 5 years ago. This sort of thing has happened before. Back in 1997, McLaren had added a second brake pedal to their cars. The thinking behind it was if they had another brake pedal, they can generate turn-in on corner entry, much like a tank does by stopping one side of the tracks, and also get better traction out of the corners once they're through and going out the other side, sort of like analog traction control. This hack cost McLaren 50 quid. But when other teams tried to come up with their own version and then over-engineered them, it was banned, at the urging of a team that races in red and is based in Italy. But in 1992, a car came along that was so advanced and so dominant that everybody was scrambling to try and copy it, and by the end of the following year, everything that had been on that car and every other car that that car had influenced was banned. The dominant team at that time had been McLaren. They'd won all but one Grand Prix in 1988 on their way to a drivers and constructors double, and repeated the feat again in 1989, then in 1990, and in 1991. Senna won the championship in 88, Prost in 89, and Senna went back-to-back in 1991, just to give you the specifics of who won what. Part of the way McLaren was able to be so dominant was partly due to its driver pairing for the first 2 years, Prost and Senna, but also because the MP44 had been designed to have the driver almost laying down in the car, like they do today. This did some black magic with centre of gravity and other bits and pieces, and made the car incredibly drivable. Formula 1 was also in the last year of the turbos in 1988, and a lot of the teams and their engine manufacturers were focused on 1989 instead, using 88 as a test session. Not Honda, they developed a warp drive. So when that dominance carried on into the early 1990s, Williams, Benetton and the rest of the teams were playing catch-up, but the FIA was just letting them get on with it. There was no sort of changing of the regulations to peg McLaren back a bit. There was no banning of oil burning, banning of front and rear interconnected suspension stuffs. It was just spend money, get good. We're not changing the rules because they're too good. You get good. And so on. But by 1990 though, it was clear that McLaren had some competition. Senna beat Prost to the driver's title, albeit controversially, and McLaren were only 11 points ahead of Ferrari come the end of that season. This being a closer finish than the previous 2 seasons, where McLaren was 64 points ahead in 1989, and yes, ahead in 1988. Williams was also on the way back up, now that a young gifted aerodynamicist had joined the team, Adrian Newey. During 1990, Newey, along with Patrick Head, Paddy Lowe and Frank Durney, started the FW14 development, which would be the successor to the FW13 used in 1990. The team had underachieved the last couple of years and needed something to get them back to the top, and the FW14 that debuted at the United States Grand Prix of 1991 was a complete departure from the previous car. Compared to the previous car, the 13B, the 14 was narrower to punch a better hole in the air, and it had the 3.5 litre Renault V10 in the back that was probably the best engine on the grid in terms of weight, power, fuel efficiency and reliability. McLaren's Honda V12 had more power, but it was heavier. Williams had basically designed the car to be as efficient as possible all round, in the hope that it would all add up to be the perfect package. Just heading back to 1990 for a second, Nigel Mansell had been getting more and more disillusioned with Formula 1. He was fed up of being Prost's number 2, and he was getting older, being 37 at that season's end. So faced with the possibility of never winning the title he so wanted, he decided to call it quits after the British Grand Prix, and was quite happy with the prospect of finishing the season and then retiring to the golf course. Such was his love of golf, Mansell only attended 2 team meetings, maybe 3 at a push, after that British Grand Prix. There was a lot of politics happening there that maybe is a video in itself. But either way, Mansell was spending more time on the fairway than he was at Maranello. He just wanted out. But Frank was left with only a single driver at the end of 1990. Frank wanted a star driver and felt that Patrese was the better driver to keep, and freed up another slot to bring in someone else, despite the other driver, Thierry Boutsen, winning more races over the course of the time that he was at Williams and scored more points than Patrese in 1990. Prost and Senna were the logical choices. They were the drivers to have, and getting hold of them would be tricky with the wages they would be demanding. Senna knew the McLaren was starting to lose its grip at the top of the pecking order, and Senna could see that the Renault engine in the Williams was getting better. If they got the chassis and aero right, it would be a brilliant car. Whether it was due to contracts, money or whatever else, Frank didn't get Prost or Senna. neither of them wanted to drive for the team. And we'll get onto all of this in a little bit because something may have happened over the course of 1991 into 1992 that could have changed F1 history forever. So Frank went and chased after Nigel. He spent good 3 or 4 weeks chasing him halfway across the world, but he finally caught up with him and managed to have a little chat. Mansell thought the plans Williams had would be good enough to eventually see him win the title. It might be immediate, it might be 2 or 3 years down the line, but it was enough for him to sign on. Well, sign back on because he was going back to Williams. But all of this was subject to Frank meeting Nigel's demands. Nigel wanted undisputed #1 status in the team, despite Patrese being there longer than him. He also wanted full support from Renault, Elf and everybody else who could be in a position to help him win, and then asked for all of those guarantees and promises from Frank to be handed over in writing. Frank said he couldn't get this done. Nigel's demands were bordering on impossible, with Nigel saying, "Oh well, guess I'll stay retired then." After 3 weeks, the impossible became possible, and Williams signed Il Leone for 1991. So Mansell was back in Red 5, the same number of the car that he had in his previous spell with the team. The number 5 being on his car wasn't because of his choice like it is today, but because of the numbering system in place back then. Basically, the numbers only changed when someone won the championship. So for 1990, Prost had the number 1 on his car, Mansell had number 2, while the McLarens had 27 and 28. Then when Senna won again in 1990, the Ferrari swapped with McLaren. The car was very competitive. Mansell won 5 races that season, including the Spanish Grand Prix, where he went wheel to wheel with Senna, almost literally as they came down the start-finish straight with sparks flying off both of the cars. But while it was competitive, it was still unreliable. The reliability mostly affected the gearbox and the electronics. Teams were starting to migrate over to the semi-automatic flappy paddle sequentials pioneered by Ferrari in the late 80s. Williams was struggling to get theirs to work properly. Also, during the Canadian Grand Prix that year, Mansell had bottled a win in embarrassing circumstances when he celebrated the win too early and let the engine revs drop too much while waving to the crowd on the final lap. Piquet would win that race, Stefano Modena was second in the Tyrrell, and Patrese was third. Mansell had been eliminated from the opening 2 rounds with gearbox failure, and a collision wiped him out at Imola. His electrics went in Belgium. The other 2 non-scores of that season were in Japan, where he spun off, and in Portugal, where he was disqualified because his wheel had flown off upon leaving the pits, and the pit crew fitted a new one where he'd come to a stop. Because he was outside of his pit box, it was deemed illegal, and he was disqualified. The title had eluded Mansell for 1991, making it the 3rd time he would finish second in his career. But during the 1991 season, Williams was cooking up something brand new for 1992 that would make them virtually unbeatable. In the winter of 1992, Williams had largely fixed their electrical and gearbox issues, and then added a traction control system to the car, which was fully legal as there was nothing in the rulebook that said it was illegal. Also added to the list of electronics was a system, the code for which was developed by Paddy Lowe, that would be the thing that made this car what it was. Active suspension wasn't Williams' idea. Lotus had played around with it before, but it had never come to fruition. Williams had been working on their own system for a few years, but it would be 1992 where they would show it to the world. In these days, Formula 1 cars were run stupidly low to the ground. It's why they fired up all those sparks into the air as teams added skid blocks to protect the floor. No planks in these days, and minimum height requirements were either lax or just non-existent. Also in these days there was no refueling, so active suspension was going to be very useful as that burns off, as active suspension allows for the car to keep the same ride height all the time, near enough to maximise the aero efficiency. As the fuel burns off, the car gets lighter, and the ride height increases as the load is taken off the suspension. While the ride height can dip slightly due to the worn tyres, it's not going to have the same ride height at the end of the race versus the start, assuming a passive suspension setup. The car also had another trick up its sleeve, which was sort of a prototype DRS. Due to the drag created by the suspension system, the car was slower in a straight line compared to how it was in 1991. A button on the wheel could drop the rear of the car down in a straight line, and it would go from being slower than in 1991 to about 10 km faster than it was before. And the best way to tell the difference between the 1991 and 1992 cars is these bulges in the bodywork where it all meets up. On this particular car, the driver had to operate all the controls for the active suspension down in the cockpit. On the following year's car, the FW14C, it would all be automated. There were some minor concerns at Williams about the car's safety. Mansell was a little bit worried that if the thing was to fail, the car would go off at very high speed and potentially injure him, but Williams had put a failsafe in. Well, I don't even want to call it a failsafe, but at least some sort of mitigation of danger system. Basically, if the electronics or the hydraulics were to fail completely on the active suspension system, the car would just drop itself right down onto the ground, and the car would skid along the tarmac, and that would slow the car down. Patrese didn't get along with the car, particularly because of his style and that he was struggling to get used to the sheer amount of performance that was on tap. Mansell, who had quite an aggressive driving style, was able to extract everything from it because he could mash the throttle on corner exit and get no slip, and he was also closer to the limit of what was available, a limit that had been pushed even further because of the car's abilities. Which is why I guess the FW14C, the car that came from 1993, wasn't as dominant as the car from 1992. This being because Prost and Hill were very smooth drivers. Yes, other teams like Benetton and McLaren had brought their own traction control, anti-lock brakes, active suspensions and other such and suches onto their cars, but Prost and Hill were very smooth drivers. They weren't pushing the limits like someone like Mansell could, or even Senna for that matter. Senna probably would have been able to extract everything from that car. And the FW15C could have been as dominant as the Red Bull was last year. And he said this year, but we're in a new year now, aren't we? And speaking of, during 1991, Senna was in contention to sign for Williams. His manager, Julian Jacobi, revealed on the Beyond the Grid podcast that Senna had turned up to the Belgian Grand Prix in 1991 with a briefcase that had 2 contracts in it. One was from McLaren and the other from Williams. During 1991, it was clear that Williams had a car that could be a winner if they sorted out the reliability, and Senna, had he chosen Williams, would have had access to Newey, Head and Lowe's Golden Goose. Jacobi said that it was loyalty to Honda that made him sign for McLaren. I don't know what the situation was regarding Mansell, whether his number 1 status contract was only for 1991 or something, but there is an alternate universe where Senna and Mansell are together at Williams for 1992. But Senna didn't sign, and Mansell stayed, either because Frank gave Mansell a new contract or he was on a multi-year deal. I'm not sure, but it is what it is. Senna might have been left wondering what could have been when Mansell turned up to the first round of the season at Kyalami and dumped 1.5 seconds on him in the first qualifying session, with Senna closing the gap to 7/10 in the second session. But the Williams was by far the superior car. In the opening laps of a race, it could be seconds a lap quicker than everybody else, with the other cars then starting to level off the performance deficit as the race went on, but the gaps were impossible to overcome. Williams would be 1-2 for the opening 3 races. Patrese retired from the Spanish Grand Prix, but Mansell would win the opening 5 races. He then came second at Monaco in that infamous duel with Senna, and then retired from the Canadian Grand Prix. 3 more races in a row were won, with the second place at the Hungarian Grand Prix, the race where he finally secured his Drivers' Championship. 3 more races in a row were won, with the second place at the Hungarian Grand Prix, the race where he finally secured his Drivers' Championship. He'd only win 1 more race that season, which was then a record set at 9, and Patrese won just the 1 race in 1992, in Japan. Car's pace in Mansell's hands was so immense that at the British Grand Prix, only the top 12 would have qualified under the modern 107% rule. After that race, Senna was caught speeding on the M25, and the copper that pulled him over asked him, "Who do you think you are, Nigel Mansell?" But the Hungarian Grand Prix, where the FW14B took the title, wasn't easy for Nigel. During qualifying, he was caught up in little bits and pieces and ended up second on the grid behind Patrese, and then had a poor start that dropped him down the order. Then he got a slow puncture, and all those other times he'd almost won but never did must have come flooding back. But thanks to the superiority of the car, he was able to pick off drivers and also got lucky with some retirements like Schumacher ahead of him, and he got into second place, which is what he needed for the title, finishing behind Senna. But while all this was going on, Williams was working on various iterations of the FW15, a car that was designed to be active from the ground up, unlike the FW14B, which was a passive car with active tech shoehorned in. Williams wasn't intending to use the FW14B with its active bits and pieces for more than a few Grand Prix, but it turned out to be so dominant they thought, might as well keep on using it. The car was so dominant Mansell was able to win the championship with a broken foot, something that caused him considerable pain in races. He'd broken it in a massive shunt at the previous season's Australian Grand Prix, a race that had to be halted after 16 or so laps because the rain was so bad. After the race, doctors wanted to do surgery on the foot, but Mansell said no, because he knew he'd be out for part of 1992, and that wasn't something he was prepared to do, probably knowing what Williams was cooking up back in Oxfordshire. Also during this time, Mansell had overtaken Stirling Moss, who wasn't yet a Sir, for being the driver with the most wins without winning the World Championship. When Mansell won the championship, he met Stirling at an event somewhere, and he said, "I took your title from you, and now I will give it back to you." And Stirling just went, "You bastard." And like already mentioned, the FW14B was such a hit that other teams started to turn up through 1993 with their own traction control systems, active suspension and fully automatic gearboxes, as well as anti-lock brakes. I did all this in a video back in 2021, and if you find that video, good god the talking head segments are awful, so I won't bore you with the details. But it was one of those arms races where the FIA felt that it had no choice but to step in and interfere. They were worried about lesser funded team systems going haywire, they were worried about speeds getting too high, they were worried about fatalities. But in a cruel ironic twist, banning the systems might have led to what was to come through 1994. Prost came into the team for 1993, and that pushed Mansell out as he and Williams couldn't come to a deal. Instead, he went off to kart, where he'd be the only person to be Formula 1 and kart champion at the same time. He won in 1992 with a broken foot, and then in 1993 he won with a broken freaking back. It's true. It's damn true. So then a look at the Williams FW14B that took Nigel Mansell to his Formula 1 World Championship after many years of trying. If this has been something new for you, then do like the video so I know I've done a good job, and for more stuff like this, get subscribed with the bell on so you never miss out on any future content. Massive thanks to the people at Patreon that continue to support at a more personal level, and if you want to help keep the picture purchasing piggy bank topped up, then there's a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, and affiliate links if you want to get some F1 merch. Underneath this video, there's super thanks if you want to do a one and done donation, and there's also memberships if you want to spam Roberto Moreno emojis in the comments. So until next time, I've been Ayrton Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.